Thank you. I'm thrilled that so many people are willing to come out when it's cold and come and listen. Oh my goodness, I see a few faces I recognize. But why don't I'm fine. I'm just fine. The main thing is to make sure that we change the sizes as they're necessary. When I'm asked about the value of public parks, I always think of Lord Joseph Devine, probably the most spectacular art dealer who ever lived. In estimating the value of a great work of art, he always said, when you pay high for the priceless, you're getting it cheap. I would say the same thing about public parks. Public parks have become as central to contemporary life as airports, streets, and highways, and all the other components of the world's infrastructure. They play a major role in enhancing well-being, improving public health, incubating a civil society, sustaining a livable environment, and providing a framework for urbanization. We have the next slide. In explaining the emergence of public parks in the Western world, it's somewhat difficult because it's complicated by the fact that landscape estates owned by European royal and noble families have always been referred to as parks. These private properties, and many still are private, are only accessible to the public on occasions and under circumstances defined by their owners. The Jardin des Tuileries in Paris was opened after the French Revolution to the public. The same thing of the Jardin de Luxembourg. And the English Garden in Munich was a garrison and hunting preserve in the city that after the French Revolution was opened to the public by the Elector of Bavaria, and then ultimately had to be completely redesigned, as I will show you a little later. Or actually, I won't, but that is not the way it looked. The other two, very much the way they looked before. And that gets to the crux of the problem. What is a public park? And it seems to me that it has to have been created and designed for recreational purposes. And when you're converting an old royal facility, you run into problems. Most people in these countries thought that they had the rights to go there. Legend has it that when Queen Caroline asked Robert Walpole what it would cost to enclose Kensington Gardens, can we have the next page, please? Kensington Gardens for her personal use, he replied, "Your crown man." So these are all royal parks that existed in London that the people in London thought they had the right to use, but then they really weren't public, and ultimately only in 1851 were they turned over to a government agency, of course, Crown agencies, to run the public parks. You're looking here at 1,365 acres of park, all of which was owned by the royal family, and is still owned by the royal family, by the way. There was a growing demand for public parks, not just in England, in France, in the United States. And the first, and I had a terrible time trying to figure out what was the first one of these places that was acquired for and designed for recreational purposes. This is probably one of the three candidates. It's the Garvin Arboretum. It opened in 1840. And you have to understand where that demand came from. The earliest public parks in Great Britain were the result of serious public demand. There was a committee of Parliament that reported as follows: "It is of the first importance to the health of the working classes on their day of rest to enjoy fresh air and be able, exempt from the dust and dirt of public thoroughfares, to walk out in decent comfort with their families. If deprived of any such resource, It is probable that their only escape from the narrow courts and alleys in which so many of the humble classes reside will be drinking shops, where in short-lived excitement they waste the means of their families and too often destroy their health. There are seats up front if you'd like. And this one is a problem because it's not because it's only 11 acres. It's got a very interesting design, like a golf course. There are these hairpin walks separated by berms and the trees, but because this wasn't really open to the public free of charge, because it was only free 2 days a week. So is this a public park yet? I don't know. On the opening day, there were 1,500 people who came. Now, Derby at that time had a population of 35,000 people. The next day, they had 9,000. The day after that, 6,000. So this was a big deal. This is the second candidate, often shown in an indecipherable map of the period. This is Birkenhead. This is a town across the Mersey River from Liverpool. And it was a developing suburb at the end of a ferry line. And this is the first park that Parliament authorized to be created by a local government. And it opened in 1843, 3 years later. Now this is, begins to be part of the way parks were thought of in the 19th century. They purchased 226 acres, used 125 for the park, and they thought they would sell off 101 acres around the park to pay for it. And what you see here in gray are the sites that they actually succeeded in selling. The gray-green, on the other hand, they couldn't auction off. So they didn't make enough money to pay for the park. The other thing, for those of you who are interested in Central Park, this is the first public park that Frederick Law Olmsted visited in 1850 in his visit to England in a book called Walks and Talks of an American Farmer in England. And he was enormously impressed because this one was open to the public, to anybody. Of course, everybody has now said that it had a huge influence on Central Park. It did not, because the circumferential road here is outside the park, not inside the park. And there are other things like that people don't seem to notice. So when you see these drawings, they were done in my office in order to clarify what's really going on in these places. So this good candidate, 3 years later, the next one is Victoria Park in London. This one happened because there was a report in 1839, again, this time by the Register General of Births, Deaths, and Marriages, which said that the mortality rate on the east end of London was higher than the rest of the city. And the causes were massive overcrowding, unsanitary conditions, polluted air. The following year, 1840, a petition was circulated, signed by 30,000 residents of the area, demanding a public park as a way of decongesting the east end of London. And Queen Victoria ordered there to be created what became Victoria Park. They also acquired more than they intended to use for the park and sold some of it off. And it isn't only England, France. This is a photograph of Paris around the middle of the 19th century. And this is a description of 1848. The greatest numbers of streets in this marvelous Paris are mere trenches, dirty and always humid with infected water. Narrowly pressed between two rows of high houses, the sun never descends into them and visits only the top of chimneys that dominate them. A pale and sickly crowd moves through them ceaselessly, foot in the gutter, nose in infection, and the eye is struck at each corner by the most repulsive filth. Now, one of the reasons for this is that you don't see this, is in those days, the cameras that they had were so slow that you had to take pictures where there were no people. And so you can't see, but this is a city of more than 1 million people with these living conditions. Needless to say, something had to be done. And the new president of France, later to become Napoleon III, donated in 1852 2 of his hunting preserves, the Bois de Vincennes and the Bois de Boulogne, to the city of Paris. And the following year, in 1853, he appointed as prefect of the Seine, basically CEO or mayor of the city, Georges Eugène Haussmann, who proceeded to transform Paris and to provide it with not just those 2 parks, with a team of very talented public officials, I might add. The 3 neighborhood parks that you see there, the Parc Monceau, the Parc des Buttes-Chaumont, the Parc Montsouris, and some 24 little squares. Not squares like we think of public squares, but actual park squares. This is what the Bois de Boulogne looked like before it was transformed into this. And that's a fundamental shift. You have to transform a park for it to be usable for recreational purposes, whether it is a hunting preserve, a piece of nature, or a very carefully designed garden, or this thing with the axial boulevards running through it. And that's what it looks like today. That is, of course, not a natural waterway at all, nor is much of anything else in the Bois de Boulogne. It's all planted and created. Those dots are where all the squares are. Now, and now you see some of the other park-like places, because these were big gardens or parts of public buildings. That's now essentially what you've got going. You've got them scattered all over the city, as well as these squares. And the squares happen, next please. The larger neighborhood parks, because of the policies of Haussmann and Adolphe Alphand, who was his landscape architect and the man who actually created most of them. This is one of them. They're embedded into the very fabric of the city, and that's fundamental. This is Parc Monceau, as it appears in Alphand's book, a drawing made in the 1870s. And you can see the park embedded in what is a part of Paris that was entirely built up around the park by real estate developers who made a great deal of money because of the added value of their property. And when I say embedded, this is what it looks like today. It is very much part of daily life in Paris, and all of these parks are. This is a map of the Rue Lafayette, which went through the city. You can see what they had to acquire in gray in order to create some of these streets. And the Square du Mont-Talon, which is 1 acre in size, is nothing more than a traffic circle. It's a way of controlling the traffic that comes in from all directions so that you don't have a disaster on the Rue Lafayette. But it's also 1 acre of public park embedded in the city. This is the Rue Lafayette. There you see this 1 acre park. Next. That's what it looks like at lunchtime, used by the people who work in the neighborhood. And this is what it looks like at 4:30 in the afternoon, when the people who live in the neighborhood are using it. It is a very important part of daily life in Paris. The other thing was a set of boulevards that were created. In this case, the grandest of all of them. This is 460 feet wide. This is the Avenue Foch, which goes from the Arch of Triumph to the Bois de Boulogne, and became the setting for the most expensive mansions and apartment houses built in the city. On either side of the central roadway are really big linear parks. But these boulevards were put through the entire city. Next. No, go back. It should come out. Oh, it's not showing up. That's a map that shows you all of the boulevards that were put through. And it's important, and I'm sorry that you can't see it, but it's important because Osman and his compatriots put together 90 miles of new streets, 65 to 100 feet wide, 700 miles of broad paved sidewalks. Now you have to understand that in every country, France and the United States, in the 1850s and 60s, there were very few paved streets. And you have to understand they all had horse droppings. And Paris, a city of 2 million at this point, New York is now passing 600,000 in 1860, just about. So 700 miles of paved sidewalks is a big deal, along with 102,000 street trees and 8,500 benches for people to sit on. Now you saw what Paris looked like, and you can imagine what the overcrowding was about. There are seats up here if you'd like to sit down. And next. The result is that this network of boulevards changed the quality of life of the city entirely. And I like to talk about the public realm. Carol was kind enough to introduce me in the title I like to use, which is the public realm strategist. Well, what is the public realm? What are we talking about? It's the streets and squares and transportation systems and public buildings. In essence, it's our living room. It's here that we encounter one another, move around, shop, do business, play, or just wander. And it is the fundamental element in any community. It is the skeleton around which everything else grows, and therefore provides the most leverage in capturing and guiding private investment in the public interest. I like to explain it this way. Sorry you can't see the map, but there would have been boulevards in Paris. There already were before Osman. But clearly when he got done, there were many, many more. Without those boulevards, there wouldn't be cafes in the same quantity. There would still be cafes. They predate all of this. And without those cafes, Paris wouldn't be Paris. It's that simple. And so parks become a central element in all of this. The same thing was happening in the United States and in New York in particular. In 1850, the absence of recreational facilities became a campaign issue in the mayoral election. And Ambrose Kingsland, who won the election, promised to create a public park. The state legislature created a commission to create a new public park. They started with a site on the East River, ultimately moved it to the place that you see here. And that is where Central Park is today. Olmsted said about it, it would have been difficult to find another body of land of 600 acres upon the island which possessed less of the most desirable characteristics of a park, or upon which more time, labor, and expense would be required to establish them. He and his partner, Calvert Voss, won a design competition to place the park there. Lose the notion that anything on that site today was on the site then. This is an entirely created landscape, and probably one of the most brilliant ever designed. Next. But to give you a sense of what went into the creation of this park, Olmsted said nearly 10 millions of ordinary city one-horse cartloads of rock and soil, which in single file would have made a procession 30,000 miles long. That was how much earth had to be moved. Think about that. 30,000 miles of one horse horse cartloads of film. Let me put it in other terms, since we're in the Skyscraper Museum. Imagine a football field 80 stories high. That's what we're talking about. That's just the Earth. In addition, 35,000 cubic yards of rock, 65,000 cubic yards of gravel, 9,000 cubic yards of sand, 270,000 trees and shrubs, 6 million bricks, 35,000 barrels of cement, and 40,000 cubic yards of manure is necessary to create the new Central Park. And to give you a sense of how significant the change was, this is a contemporary drawing of the southeastern corner of Central Park. You're looking at 59th Street, roughly Fifth Avenue. Next. That's what it looks like today. Lest you ever thought that that was what it looked like to begin with, I think this should convince you to the contrary. But we've got to move on, and you all know Central Park pretty well. So I asked myself in writing the new book, what are the key roles of public parks? It seems to me there are 4. Enhancing personal well-being and public health, incubating a civil society, sustaining a livable environment, and providing a framework for urbanization. And I want to show you how that works. Next. Let's start with enhancing personal well-being. Think for a moment about, well, most of you, well, not all of you, but many of you are old enough to remember a world in which people didn't go jogging. They go jogging because there's no other place for recreation today, except health clubs. Well, just to give you a sense, the number of health club members in 1990 was 20 million. The number of health club members in 2006 was 41 million. This is very important to our society and very important, next, in creating the parks. This is one of those royal parks that I was showing you before, St. James Park, in a painting from my favorite museum in the city. Does anybody recognize the painting on the left? It's by Thomas Gainsborough, and it is of St. James Park. Anybody recognize it? It's in the dining room of the Frick Museum. That's what it looked like 4 years ago when I took the picture. By the way, all the color photographs are mine, and all the maps are mine as well. You can see people needed a place for recreation. It's a different class, that's true. A different kind of recreation, that's true. But this has been part and parcel of the use of parks from the beginning. Next. Here you get it at its most visible. I don't know a place where personal well-being and recreation is more visible than Jones Beach. How many people here have been to Jones Beach in the last 5 years? Raise your hand. I don't have to explain anything more. You know exactly what I mean. And next. This is a park on the waterfront in Louisville, created in the last 30 years. Again, not only are the children sure as to the reason they're there, so are their parents. Next. This gives you some sense of the numbers. In Houston, that trail that we're talking about is a trail that is from about 2 2/3 mile. Look how many users during the year. Look at the kinds of things that go on, stretching, just ordinary kinds of things. So one of the functions of a public park has to do with personal well-being. Next. The second is incubating a civil society. And this is, I think, one of the least understood and probably the most important of the principles. A park is a mixing valve of every class, every race, every income. And if a park is properly designed, Next. You can see them at the same time, in the same space, using it without causing trouble to anybody else. This is Prospect Park, and let me read you what Olmsted says about this. It's a place where, with evident glee in the prospect of coming together, all classes with a common purpose, not at all intellectual, competitive with none, disposing of jealousy and spiritual or intellectual pride towards none, each individual adding by his mere presence to the pleasure of all others, all helping to the greater happiness of each. Now, you learn how to be a citizen in a place like this. Any of the great parks act as that sort of thing. If you don't believe me, next. Let me take you to Manhattan in the late 1880s. This is Mulberry Bend. It's a few blocks away from here. You'll recognize it in a minute. This is a photograph by Jacob Riis. And in 1887, the state passed the Small Parks Act, which authorized the city of New York to acquire private property for the creation of small parks. And the first park to be created was by taking out this slum. Riis had been not just a journalist, he was a police reporter and a photographer. And many of you, I'm sure, have read How the Other Half Lives, or some of his other books. Next. That's what it looks like today. And this is what he said. I do not believe that there was a week in all the 20 years that I had to do with Mulberry Bend as a police reporter in which I was not called to record there a stabbing or shooting affair, some act of violence. This he wrote 5 years after the park had been created. It is now 5 years since the Bend became a park, and the police reporter has not had business there during that time. Not once has a shot been fired or a knife drawn. That's pretty dramatic. Well, you can say, well, that's the 19th century. Those were terrible slums. What about today? Next. I'm old enough, and so are many of you, to remember when Central Park looked like that. During the fiscal crisis of the mid-70s, and even before, this park began to deteriorate. And it deteriorated because the budget was cut. The first thing that happens in fiscal, in days of fiscal problems is they fire the planning. The planners go first, the park people come second. And that's what Central Park looked like. It was so bad, because people didn't want to go there, that by 1980, there were 1,006 felonies during the year, 709 robberies, and 9 murders. Next. Could you, I really want to move fast as we go through this. So, no, go back. Next slide. No, go backwards, please. Thank you. But please, I do want to move fast because it's going too slow. What happened is Elizabeth Barlow Rogers, a rather remarkable woman who's still around, by the way, created and started the Central Park Conservancy. The Central Park Conservancy came in 1980 to step in to fix Central Park because the money wasn't available. They raised money from people who lived around Central Park and corporations nearby who had enough money, and they began the restoration of Central Park. Next. Next. It looks like this today. Now, what happened? People started coming back to Central Park. In 2003, instead of 1,000 felonies, there were only 93. Instead of 709 robberies, there were only 34. Instead of 9 murders, there were none. Next, please. The third use of a public park is to sustain a livable environment. Next. When you live in a place like this, the air quality is not very good. The ambient temperature tends to be quite high because of the reflective surfaces, especially during the summertime. This is not a place where birds are likely to hang out. It's not very pleasant. The city of New York, starting under Henry Stern, started transforming these traffic islands into something called green streets. Next. That's what it looks like now. The ambient temperature is lower accordingly. The air quality is better because, as we all know, photosynthesis takes carbon dioxide and turns it into oxygen. And we now have nearly 2,000 of these that have been created. Next. There are other cities that do the same thing. This is probably the oldest of them. 1883, Minneapolis began its park system. And to give you some sense of what that system is like, we're talking about 6,600 acres for 360,000 people. That's 54 people per acre. 60 miles of parkway, 43 miles of walking and bicycle trails, 17 lakes and ponds, and nobody is more than 6 blocks from a park. Next, please. I don't have to tell you that the quality of life in Minneapolis around these parks is quite different. This is certainly a sustainable environment. Next. The fourth and last of these uses is providing a framework for urbanization. And let me try to explain to you what I'm talking about. Again, I'm going to Olmsted. I worship at the shrine of Frederick Olmsted, as you will find if you look in my book. In almost every chapter, he's quoted more than once. He said that parks have a much greater influence on the progress of a city and its general structure than any other ordinary public works. And I thought I'd show you one of my favorite examples. Next. In San Antonio, in the beginning of the 20th century, they had regular flooding. The San Antonio River would overflow. It caused problems. The leadership and engineers in San Antonio, after this particular case, and in 1921, the flood killed 51 people and caused, in those days, more than $3 million of damage. That's, in today's dollars, considerably more. They said, put it into a conduit, pave it over. And the citizenry refused. Eventually, they found a solution. Next, please. As you can see, the river bends around, so they put in locks on either side and dug through a passage so that when the floodwaters were coming, the water would bypass the downtown. Next. And here you can see this is 1929-30. This is going in. But they left the river and the back ends of the buildings onto that river. Next. They got a grant of WPA money, some $355,000, to which they added $75,000 of city bond money and produced the Riverwalk. And that's what it looked like as we entered into the Second World War. There was no way that this was going to stimulate very much at that point. Next. That's what it looks like today. It's the second most actively used tourist attraction in the city of San Antonio after the Alamo. And it adds immeasurably to the economy of the city. It is quite different from what it was at the beginning of the 20th century. Next. Now, if you remember, I kept saying parks are not preserved pieces of nature. They are the result of an evolving interaction between nature and people. And that's very important to understand. It's not preserved nature. Look at how much went into creating either the Riverwalk or Central Park or any of these places. And its life begins when the ribbon is cut. And it changes and changes and changes. And I want to show you an example of a relationship between a population of the city and the evolution of a park. Next, please. Let's start with Jackson Park in Chicago. In 1871, Olmsted made that drawing of a proposal to create a park along the shore of Lake Michigan. They didn't have enough money to get very far because that's what it looked like in 1890. They hadn't the money to continue. There was a South Park Commission, a Lincoln Park Commission, and a West Park Commission. And the South Park Commission couldn't proceed. Olmsted was then brought in, along with Daniel Burnham, to design the World's Fair of 1893, the World's Columbian Exposition, it was called. This is their plan of 1893. After the fair was over, the Olmsted firm proceeded to redesign the park, and out came this. So it's already evolved greatly over more than 2 decades. Next, please. That's what it looks like today. There were no golf courses in any of those plans. And we have to remember that the people who live around these places have demands, and they make those demands. In the case, next please, in Chicago, the lake shore evolved over a long period of time, not just Burnham and Olmsted. This is the Loop of Chicago. This is a photograph of 1868. This is where Grant Park is today. And at the beginning of the city, it was supposed to be ever free and clear and available to the public, right? What's available here? There's a railroad that runs through there. There's a fetid swamp in between that and the, quote, park. This is Michigan Avenue. Next, please. So, in 1894, Daniel Burnham began making proposals for the connection between Jackson Park and Grant Park downtown. And these are some of the drawings that evolved over time. They are from the Plan of Chicago of 1909. And you can see there's Jackson Park, and there's the proposed Grant Park. Montgomery Ward, the man who had the mail order catalog business and department store, decided that something had to be done to prevent the lakeshore from being used for things that kept it from being forever open, and free, and clear. And he went to court and stopped them from building things there. Next, please. So here again, 1863 is this Grant Park downtown on Michigan Avenue. Next, please. No, go backwards, please. This is 1863. Next. That's what it looks like today. Talk about a framework and the interaction. And some of you may know that $500 million was just recently spent, next, to fill in that rail yard in the northern section of Grant Park and create next Millennium Park. That's the Anish Kapoor sculpture, and this is the Joan Cleanza fountain, which I think is probably the most actively used piece of the park in good weather, with kids from all over the region coming. This has had a huge impact. Now look, we've been looking at 140 years of evolution of this park along the shore of Lake Michigan. Just to give you a sense, of the 3,130 acres of park that's been created there, 2,000 acres are landfill. It's a park with 25 public beaches, 9 harbors accommodating 5,000 boats, 6 museums, 3 theaters, 4 band shells, a zoo, a planetarium, 2 water treatment plants, the nation's largest convention center, a 61,000-seat stadium, and an amusement park. Now, tell me that a park is preserved nature? Certainly not there. And next, please. The transformation, and you can see all the landfill in this. This is Jackson Park here. That's Grant Park there. Look at Chicago. It is completely reshaped and is now a city that is so dominated by the lakeshore that it is its most important feature. So parks are not just pieces of nature that are put away and roped off from the people. Next, please. In fact, I'd like to demonstrate that. This is a photograph of 1892 of Lake Michigan. Next. And that's what it looked like this summer. Next. Next. The most important thing about parks is that they are living things, and you have to take care of them. And you can't do that without money and without people. And most importantly, people to take care of the parks. Stewardship is probably the single most important thing. And let me give you a few examples. Next, right here in New York, too. When Robert Moses became the Parks Commissioner in 1934, he found some money. He was very good at that. And one of the things that he found, there was a fund that was supposed to memorialize veterans. And he created a number of playgrounds out of that fund. This one being the Sauer Playground. You see what it looked like in 1935. It's on 12th Street between Avenue A and Avenue B. And when I first came to Sauer Playground, next please, it looked like that. It was dangerous. That's a photograph I took in 1989, just to give you a sense. This was a hangout for pushers and homeless and prostitutes and all kinds of activity. And finally, the 12th Street Block Association rose up and said, they want no more of this. They want this fixed. And they persuaded finally the Parks Department that this was important. That wasn't much help until they got the borough president to put it in as a spending priority in the capital budget. And so ground was broken in 1992 for its rehabilitation. Next, please. That's what it looks like now. It's fixed up. Also, the Block Association locks up at night and reopens it in the morning. And they worry about it, and they take care of it. And that is very important. Next, please. Let's go back to Central Park. It's the same thing there. This was the state of Central Park around 1980. And again, one of the things that happened was that we started to take care of it. Next, please. And the brilliance of Thomas Hoving, who was then the Parks Commissioner under Mayor Lindsay, was that you needed to bring people back. And so he began a program of happenings and public events. This is probably the most attended concert ever in Central Park, Barbra Streisand, in 1967. But he didn't count on the fact that when you have all those people, next please, that's what happened. And you have to invest money in taking care of this. The Conservancy was created 13 years after this, and it began to raise the money. Next, please. Now, it looks like that, and it's taken care of, and the Conservancy's budget is substantial. Next, please. My favorite story is about this park, Bryant Park, behind the public library. It looked like that around 1920. Actually, I think it's your postcard. I'm not sure. But it's a place that had trouble because there was an elevated subway on 6th Avenue, which made a lot of noise and brought dirt. And it became a hangout for homeless men in the late 1920s. Got much worse when the Depression hit. And in 1934, Robert Moses, who had become the Parks Commissioner, remembered that there had been a design competition for this place. The architects, wanting to help their unemployed brethren at the beginning of the Depression, held a design competition to fix Bryant Park. One has to laugh because we know that design is not the source of the problem, but rather stewardship. In any case, next please. The following year, this park opened. It looks very much like that today, as you know, with much desired additions, subtractions, and clarifications. But when it opened, I found a newspaper article. Fiorello LaGuardia came to the ribbon cutting, and the newspaper reporter found the mayor and said to him, "How do you know that this park isn't going to deteriorate all over again?" Now, knowing what I know and what most of you know about what happened to Bryant Park, this is an extraordinary question to read. The mayor answered, "As long as we have Moses, we don't have to worry." He knew what he was talking about. I had no idea how clever the man was. And the more I studied New York, the more amazed I am at LaGuardia. In any case, we all know it began to deteriorate. Next, please. And the first murder occurred in 76 rather. The second murder in 1977. By the way, Moses stepped down as park commissioner in 1960. And a group of determined citizens, business leaders, the New York Times, the Rockefeller brothers, came together and they hired Dan Biederman, who's now the head of the Bryant Park Corporation, and William H. White to advise them on how to fix the park. These are from one of Holly White's books. First thing he said, you can't see into the park because the bushes are so overgrown that when the police car drives by on 42nd Street, they can't see him. The other thing is there's nothing that would lead you to go in there. You need some attractions that will bring people. Well, Dan Biederman proceeded to take all of that advice and transform Bryant Park. Next, please. First thing that happened, those bushes went away. We now have low flowers, and the wrought iron you can see through. The stairs were extended, and there are additional stairs so you can see in. Next, please. And then a series of things put into the park. Restaurants, cafes, kiosks that sell coffee and sandwiches to bring people into the park. My office is half a block from here. In the summertime, there at noontime, you will find a couple of thousand people there. That is a huge difference. And they have movies on Monday nights. The average attendance is 6,000. When they had the Wizard of Oz in 1997, they had 12,000. At lunchtime, it goes up to 5,000 people there. Next, please. So when I think about parks, I really think about my favorite park. I have been going to Central Park over and over again for nearly 7 decades now. And I have concluded that it excels in performing the roles that every great park must play: enhancing well-being and improving public health, incubating a civil society, sustaining a livable environment, and providing a framework for urbanization. That is what makes New York livable.